Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. Oh boy, this one is not gonna be easy, is it? Hi there guys, it's Adam Martyn here, and today we're going to be talking about the situation involving Gary Lineker and the BBC. Now, I'm sure for many of my UK viewers, I'm sure you will have at least heard about this in the last week or so, about the events surrounding this. Those of you who watch from other countries, maybe you haven't heard of this, so I'm going to do my best to go through the situation that's been happening, explain the relevant context, and potentially what this could mean for both Gary as a presenter and the BBC as a whole. So where do we begin with this rather tetchy subject topic? Well, I think we should start by looking towards the UK government and specifically this video.
Enough is enough. We must stop the boats.
This is Suella Braverman. She is the current Home Secretary here of the UK, and she's not been happy about people coming across the channel in these small boats. And basically, together with the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, they're going to try and implement a new illegal migration bill to stop these, well, not necessarily stop the boats coming over, but if you come over on these boats, you basically will not be granted asylum here in the UK, and you have a high chance of being deported either back to your home country or a different country entirely. I personally think this is a horrific idea, and it seems so that did Gary Lineker. And when asked about this, he tweeted out something that was basically the catalyst for this entire event happening. So this is the tweet in question. He put, "There is no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s, and I'm out of order?" So what he means by that is the government, again, namely Suella Braverman, has used language such as invasion, huge influx and stuff like that. You could argue this is akin to similar or, similar language used by Germany as it was back in the 1930s. I'm sure for those of you who know your history, you'll know what I'm referring to there. Now, whether you agree with Gary Lineker on this tweet or not, that's completely up to you. I'm not here to say you should think a certain way or anything like that. You might agree with Gary, you might not agree with him, or this situation as a whole, that's completely up to you. But it seems that this tweet was a step too far, because Gary Lineker, as many UK viewers will know, is the face of a sporting programme here called Match of the Day, which has been on air for decades and decades and decades, and he's been presenting it for nearly 25 years now. Some would argue he's one of the quote-unquote faces of the BBC. He's one of the most recognisable presenters that the corporation has, and he's also their highest paid star, and he has been for a number of years. So this got him into trouble with some of the higher-ups of the BBC, because the BBC as an organisation, at best, is meant to be impartial. For those of you who don't know what that means, is that when, particularly in reporting news, presenters on the BBC should not express a very, partisan political opinion. They should not express solidarity with one party over another and stuff like that. So when it comes to, say, elections or scandals going on in government, they just merely report the news. They're not meant to try and necessarily dig too much into one party or support another. That's the idea in question. Has the BBC always got that right in its 100 years? No, of course not. Whether, consciously or subconsciously, there have been blips where the BBC, just quite frankly, has not been able to remain impartial. And again, the critics will, some people will say the BBC has always been left-leaning, some will say it's always been right-leaning. It can't really win on that front, but I'd always like to think that the corporation does try its best. So because of this, Gary Lineker, because of this tweet, he was asked to step back from presenting Match of the Day until the issue was resolved. So basically what that means is those in control, the higher-ups of the BBC, basically viewed Gary's tweet as a step too far. It wasn't impartial at all. It was very much a criticism, a dig at the current government. Again, whether you agree with that or not, that is completely up to you. But it was a step too far for the higher-ups at the BBC, and Gary was asked to step back. And oh boy, did this open the floodgates. So it became clear that Gary wasn't going to be presenting Match of the Day, the weekend just gone. And, maybe the BBC thought, okay, we can't broadcast Match of the Day that's fine. We can deal with that. But it didn't just stop there. But let's just focus. When Match of the Day did go ahead, there was an apology with the continuity announcement, and it was reduced to just a 20-minute edition. There were no presenters, no pundits, and no commentary, and other football coverage was dropped too. But why were there no pundits? Why was there no one else? Well, because they all walked out in solidarity with Gary. Big hitters like Ian Wright and Alan Shearer, they said they weren't going to present in solidarity with Gary. This crossed over into other programs as well, other sports programs on the BBC here. It moved, again, it moved away from that. So if all your presenters, are backing out because of this, if they're standing in solidarity, it doesn't just become an issue about one presenter anymore. It becomes a wider issue, and indeed, as a BBC article it says, a test of the BBC's values. So with sports programme immeasurably disrupted over the last weekend, clearly something had to change, and many describe this as an own goal by the BBC, and I'm inclined to agree. By taking Gary Lineker off the air, and inciting all of this solidarity, all these other presenters walking away, the BBC wasn't left within much choice. If they completely got rid of Gary Lineker, that would arguably inflame the situation and make it a lot worse, and they'd probably lose a great deal many more presenters as well. If they took him back immediately, that then makes the BBC look really foolish, like they're not confident in their decisions and all that sort of stuff. So it really was a no-win situation for the corporation, if you ask me. But I mean, this doesn't happen often. Seeing the disruption for Match of the Day and other programmes, it was really up to the schedulers at the BBC to amend the schedule lightning fast to something different. And, yes, it would have disappointed a lot of people, but funnily enough, Match of the Day actually got higher viewing figures than it did the previous week, probably due to all the controversy and people just wanted to see, how things turned out. But that's always going to happen, though, with peak news stories like this. One article from the BBC about this whole thing, interestingly, says this. It's worth noting that complaints about Lineker's politically charged tweets are not new. In 2016 and 2018, the BBC defended comments made by the Match of the Day presenter about child migrants and Brexit by saying he was a freelance presenter. It was a private Twitter account, and the stringent rules for journalists did not apply equally to sports presenters. And, okay, that's what they defended, but why has that changed now? It seems very odd that in the intervening years that would change, and it could partly be due to the new Director General, Tim Davie, who stepped in, and he was all about impartiality. But let's just take a quick look at the editorial guidelines themselves. Just looking at a snippet, it says, presenters primarily associated with the BBC's public expressions of opinion have the potential to compromise the BBC's impartiality and to damage its reputation. Opinions expressed on social media are put into the public domain, can be shared, and are searchable. The risk is greater where the public expressions of opinion overlap with the area of the individual's work. The risk is lower where an individual is expressing views publicly on an unrelated area. For example, a sports or science presenter expressing views on politics or the arts. So these guidelines are in place, and as written basically implies if you're a sports or science presenter, for example, expressing your personal opinion, say on your Twitter account, is less risky for the BBC because that's not what you're associated with. So if that's what it says in the guidelines, why on earth did this all blow up in the first place? Well, you could argue it's due to the status of Gary Lineker himself. He's not just, your average presenter. He is the sports presenter people know on the BBC. As I said, he's been doing this for nearly 25 years now. He's known up and down the country. He's the BBC's highest paid star or highest paid presenter, whatever you want to call it. So even though his area is sport, some maybe would make the argument that because of his status, even if he's talking about politics, that could compromise the BBC's impartiality. That's just it's food for thought there. I'm not saying he shouldn't have tweeted. I think he could, he's perfectly valid on his own private Twitter account to make that statement as is. But I can definitely see some people making an argument as to why the BBC jumped here. But of course, the question does raise around this is why? Why was this jump made so severely? Why was this taken so seriously and escalated so high? Well, what about the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie? What did he think about all this? As I say, when Tim Davie came in, he was all about impartiality. He wanted to see that through, and clearly for him this was a step too far. But some argue there could have been other involvement in this, namely by a man by the name of Richard Sharp. Now, Richard Sharp holds the position of chairman of the BBC. Quite an important role. And this guy isn't necessarily in clean water anyway. He's currently being investigated over his relationship with Boris Johnson, and the fact that, well, the inquiry is investigating whether he failed to properly disclose details of his involvement in the facilitation of an £800,000 loan guarantee for the then PM Boris Johnson. He denies everything, but this is still going on at the minute. But basically, you know, this guy Richard Sharp, he's got friends in high places. He's friends with quite a few members of the Tory party in question. So some have made the argument, and again, this is purely rumour and speculation and theory at this point, there's nothing confirmed, but some made the argument that, you know, in light of this, Richard Sharp was not happy, or the government wasn't happy, particularly Suella Braverman, even maybe Rishi Sunak. They weren't happy about what Gary said, and basically nudged Richard Sharp very, very sharply, pardon the pun, to basically take action and either suspend or completely remove Gary Lineker off the air, which would potentially explain why this all happened so quickly. Again, though, I do want to reiterate, this is just speculation. There's no confirmation on this whatsoever, and even if it was asked, he'd probably stringently deny it anyway. But it's important to note that the chairman of the BBC, who's currently being investigated for not disclosing loans to a former Prime Minister, well, the then Prime Minister, you know, again, impartiality, when you're asking about impartiality, if it extends to the top, if the chairman's not impartial, then that will damage the corporation's reputation even further. Eventually, talks were held between Gary and the BBC, and it seems that he is now is going to be coming back to Match of the Day. Some people have expressed, you know, great that this has been solved, Rishi Sunak being one of them. However, other people in the government were criticising. A Tory backbencher, Philip Davis, said that the decision was a pathetic capitulation to Lineker and the start of the end for the licence fee. Another ex-cabinet minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is a loathed individual on my part, unfortunately. He warned that the licence fee has passed its sell-by date, so again, more flack from the BBC. Some support, though, some support from certain people. But again, one thing I want to raise is that Gary Lineker isn't the only presenter who you could argue has made a politically aligned or motivated tweet who works at the BBC. For example, you have Alan Sugar, who is the very popular host of the show The Apprentice, which has been going for years. A few years ago, he made some tweets basically saying why you shouldn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn in that election. And again, whether you agree with him or not on that view, that's completely up to you. But is that not politically skewed? Andrew Neil's another one who worked for the BBC for a long time on political matters. His role in the news team was to deal with specific political events. He himself over the past has made tweets or comments on social media or other programmes that you can argue skew in one partisan way. So why on earth Gary Lineker is the outlier? Someone who doesn't even work on the main news team. His role is in sports, you know. It seems very odd. It seems very odd of the BBC to suddenly, you know, take this stance. So yesterday, on March the 13th, Gary posted this, saying, "After a surreal few days, I'm delighted we've navigated a way through this. I want to thank you all for the incredible support, particularly my colleagues at BBC Sport for the remarkable show of solidarity. Football is a team game, but their backing was overwhelming. I have been presenting sport on the BBC for almost 3 decades, and am immeasurably proud to work with the best and fairest broadcaster in the world. I cannot wait to get back in the Match of the Day chair on Saturday." There's more to it as well on that tweet, but obviously he's very happy to go back there. It's clear he still holds a lot of respect for the BBC. He also thanked Tim Davie, the Director General. He said, "I'd like to thank him for his understanding during this difficult period. He has an almost impossible job keeping everybody happy, particularly in the area of impartiality. I'm delighted that we'll continue to fight the good fight together." So is this all done and dusted for good? Well, arguably, the immediate situation might be fixed, but this raises serious questions for the BBC as a corporation and its impartiality core, if you like. The fact that it reacted so violently to this, in the sense that it was so immediate, it was so thorough, it does make you wonder where this will lead the corporation going forward. Tim Davie himself has come in interviews since the resolution and said maybe we need to look at the editorial guidelines, maybe we need to amend them to either be more clear or more stringent or something like that. If he does edit the guidelines, I mean, if I was in charge of the BBC, what would I do? I personally think the guidelines as they were, when it comes to news presenters, if they were making statements like very objective political statements, very clear on their Twitter accounts and their newscasters of the BBC, I would argue maybe that does breach impartiality because of, again, the news the newscaster presence, all that sort of stuff. And a lot of newscasters, you know, their profiles represent that they're on the news. They actually encourage sometimes on the news, hey, get in touch with me on Twitter as well. So it is a very much a grey area there. But for someone like Gary Lineker and a lot of the freelancers, I'd like to think they should have a bit more free rein to speak their minds, to speak their opinions, and not face as severe repercussions as Gary Lineker did. If the BBC wanted to talk to him, then that's one thing. But to ask him to step back and basically issue a pseudo suspension, it's a little bit odd and not the best look for the BBC, if you ask me. At the end of the day, like I said, the BBC at its heart is supposed to be a public service broadcaster, an impartial organisation. And has it always met that mark? No, of course it hasn't. But I always have liked to believe that, you know, having worked with them in some capacity myself over the years and being obviously a long time admirer or an interest in their history, I'd like to think the BBC has always at least tried to strafe. That's why a lot of broadcasters, a lot of presenters like working at the BBC, because they're just providing a service. Like, you know, other companies like ITV, Channel 4, the litany of commercial channels, they don't have to be impartial. If they want to really criticise the current government, they can do. If they want to bash the opposition, they can do. They have the freedom to do that. The BBC doesn't, but I'd argue that that emphasis on like news and just getting facts across, getting stories across is more focused, it's more emphasized as a result. So I do hope that this doesn't leave too much lasting damage. And of course, let's not forget, this was a criticism of the government and what they're doing. The aim shouldn't be at the BBC necessarily. Well, maybe for the Gary Lineker decision, sure, but on wider, this needs to be looked at back to the government. They're the ones in charge. They're the ones issuing these talking points, these policies. So that's what we should be focusing on, if you ask me. Will this damage trust in the BBC? Potentially, yes. There's a lot of sports fans out there, and I think the fact that it will be seen as a betrayal on the BBC's part, on some part, to do what they did will result in damage. Does this make the case good for the BBC going forward in terms of the licence fee? No. But, you know, we've seen some bigger stories than this have been forgotten about in the annals of time, so it wouldn't honestly surprise me if, give it a year or two, this will all be forgotten. Whether it should or not, again, that's up to you to decide as an individual viewer. But that is the situation on a whole as is. I just wanted to give a rundown on this. I thought it would be good to. Obviously, I've been following this, and some of you have actually been asking me, you know, are you going to talk about this? Are you going to leave it? I did go back and forth on this because, again, I know this is a very contentious topic, but I hope I've tried to just get across, you know, what this whole thing was about, what unfurled about it, and what I personally think, you know, should have happened, maybe shouldn't have happened, what should go forward, because that's all our prerogative as individuals. We have our right to our opinion. Whether people disagree with us or not, that's their prerogative. But if you enjoyed this video, please do leave a like on it. We really do appreciate it. And let me know your thoughts about this in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel if you're brand new as well. We'd love to have you aboard. Apologies if my voice sounds really hoarse. I've been going through losing it a little bit, so talking's actually really difficult, so I do apologize. But if you want to check out other stuff as well, you can subscribe to AMTV Now, which is all about Now That's What I Call Music, and AMTV Who, which centers around Doctor Who. So go and check us out there. In the meantime, though, I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Hooks Media, Ben Freeman, Ethan Carberry-Holt, The Broken Kitsumanoid, Globe of Reviews, Derek Chambers, Sean Nock, Dord Khan, and Fabina UPC V2.0, our AMTV staff members.